What if I told you that the strangers whose homes you sleep in might be watching your every move, documenting your habits, or worse, that some guests check in but never actually check out? Tonight, I'm sharing 7 terrifying true stories that will make you think twice before booking that perfect Airbnb deal. These aren't just bad reviews or dirty bathrooms. These are real accounts of travelers who discovered their hosts had sinister intentions that went far beyond hospitality. From hidden cameras recording intimate moments to underground rooms where previous guests are still trapped, these stories reveal the dark side of the sharing economy that travel apps don't want you to know about. One guest found detailed journals documenting every visitor's personal fears and vulnerabilities, while another discovered they were being slowly poisoned for illegal medical experiments. Some hosts follow their favorite guests across multiple cities, recreating their exact living situations in a twisted form of stalking, and others use remote properties as hunting grounds where no one can hear you scream for help. What makes these stories even more chilling is how ordinary they start. A great price, beautiful photos, excellent reviews, but behind those 5-star ratings lurk hosts who view their guests not as customers, but as prey. If you're brave enough to hear how these innocent vacations turned into living nightmares, make sure to click that subscribe button and hit the bell icon, because these true horror stories will change how you travel forever. And trust me, you'll want to be notified when I expose more terrifying truths that happen when we place our lives in strangers' hands. Story 1. The Watcher's Nest. Sarah Martinez thought she'd found the perfect writing retreat when she booked a charming cabin nestled in the Oregon woods for 2 weeks. The listing showed a cozy interior with rustic wooden beams, a stone fireplace, and large windows overlooking a serene lake. The host, a man named David Chen, had impeccable 5-star reviews praising his attention to detail and hospitality. Sarah, a freelance journalist struggling to finish her novel, needed complete isolation to meet her publisher's deadline. The $89 per night rate seemed too good to be true for such a picturesque location, but David's profile showed he was a retired teacher who simply enjoyed hosting creative types. When Sarah arrived on a foggy Sunday evening, David greeted her with homemade cookies and a detailed tour of the property, explaining every amenity with genuine enthusiasm. He showed her the well-stocked kitchen, pointed out the best writing spots, and even left a handwritten note about local hiking trails and the nearest grocery store 20 miles away. The first 3 days were exactly what Sarah had hoped for. She established a routine of writing by the large bay window each morning, taking afternoon walks around the lake, and spending evenings by the fireplace editing her work. The cabin felt like a sanctuary, completely disconnected from the digital world except for basic internet that allowed her to back up her writing. David checked in once via text to ensure everything was satisfactory, but otherwise respected her privacy completely. Sarah made remarkable progress on her novel, writing more in those 3 days than she had in the previous month. She even posted a photo of her writing setup on Instagram, captioning it, "Found my perfect creative haven." Everything changed on Thursday morning when Sarah noticed something odd about the bathroom mirror. While brushing her teeth, she spotted what looked like a tiny hole in the decorative wooden frame surrounding the glass. At first, she assumed it was just a knot in the wood, or maybe where a screw had been removed, but something about its perfectly circular shape and the way it seemed to catch light made her uncomfortable. That evening, Sarah decided to investigate further. Using her phone's flashlight, she examined the hole more closely and felt her blood run cold when she realized it was definitely not a natural imperfection in the wood. The hole was precisely drilled and seemed to go completely through the frame. Her hands trembling, Sarah grabbed a chair and climbed up to get a better angle, shining her light behind the mirror. What she saw made her stomach lurch. There was definitely a small device mounted behind the glass, its lens pointing directly into the bathroom. Sarah immediately grabbed her laptop and began searching the entire cabin, methodically checking every room with her phone light. Her worst fears were confirmed when she discovered more tiny holes, one in the bedroom behind a decorative wall hanging, another in the living room concealed within a bookshelf, And, most disturbing of all, one positioned to view the entire kitchen and dining area where she'd been eating all her meals. The holes were so expertly hidden that she never would have noticed them if she hadn't been specifically looking. Sarah's mind raced as she realized the implications. Someone had been watching her every private moment, showering, changing clothes, sleeping, even her personal phone calls with her boyfriend back home. She felt violated in a way that made her physically ill, but her journalistic instincts kicked in and she began documenting everything with photos and videos. As she searched more thoroughly, Sarah made an even more disturbing discovery. Behind the couch in the living room, partially hidden beneath the wooden platform, she found a loose floorboard. When she pried it up, her heart nearly stopped. Inside was a collection of notebooks, each labeled with different dates spanning the past 3 years. Sarah grabbed the most recent one with shaking hands and opened it to find detailed handwritten entries about previous guests. The entries weren't just casual observations. They were comprehensive psychological profiles written in David's neat handwriting. The notebook contained entries like, Guest number 47, Jennifer Walsh, arrives 3:15 p.m., immediately checks all locks and windows. Obvious anxiety disorder, probably childhood trauma. Day 3. Confirmed, has nightmare every night around 2:30 a.m., calls mother for comfort. Weakness identified. Another entry read, Guest number 52, Marcus Thompson, confident exterior but compensates with expensive belongings. Day 5, cries during phone calls with ex-wife, drinks heavily after 9 p.m. Vulnerability confirmed, divorce proceeding poorly. Each guest had multiple pages dedicated to their private moments, fears, habits, and personal struggles that David had observed through his hidden cameras. Sarah found entries about guests' medical conditions, financial problems, relationship issues, and deeply personal conversations they'd had in what they thought was complete privacy. The level of detail was horrifying. David knew which guests took medication, who had eating disorders, who was struggling with depression, and he documented it all with clinical precision. But the most terrifying discovery came when Sarah found a separate notebook labeled Special Interests. This contained more detailed profiles of certain guests who had apparently caught David's particular attention. These entries included printed screenshots from the hidden cameras showing guests in various states of undress, along with David's written commentary about their physical attributes and private behaviors. Sarah found photos of women sleeping, showering, and changing clothes, each accompanied by David's disturbing observations and ratings. Some entries indicated that David had kept these special interest guests under surveillance even after they'd left the cabin, somehow obtaining their social media information and tracking their online activity. One entry showed he'd been following a guest's Instagram account for over a year, commenting on her posts under fake profiles and learning details about her daily routine back home. The final section of the special interest notebook contained what appeared to be David's future plans. He had written detailed strategies for extending certain guests' stays through various manipulation tactics, creating fake emergencies that would delay their departure or disabling their vehicles so they'd need to remain at the cabin longer. Most chilling of all, Sarah found evidence that David had been gradually escalating his behavior. Early entries from 3 years ago were limited to simple observations, but recent entries showed he'd begun interfering with guests' lives in small ways, slightly moving their personal items to create psychological unease, adjusting the temperature at night to disrupt their sleep patterns, and even adding mild sedatives to the welcome treats he provided to ensure guests would sleep deeply while he accessed their rooms to install additional surveillance equipment. Sarah realized she was potentially in immediate danger. David clearly had escalating obsessive behaviors, and she had no way of knowing if he was currently watching her through the cameras or if he might physically return to the property. Her phone had no cellular signal, and the landline David had shown her was obviously compromised since he controlled it. Sarah made the terrifying decision to pretend everything was normal while she planned her escape. She carefully replaced all the notebooks exactly as she'd found them and continued her normal routine, but now every moment felt like a performance for David's hidden cameras. She forced herself to write, eat meals, and even shower normally, all while knowing someone was watching and possibly recording everything. That night, Sarah barely slept, jumping at every sound and wondering if David was somewhere nearby monitoring the feeds in real time. The next morning, Sarah implemented her escape plan. She packed her belongings normally, left a casual thank you note mentioning she was checking out a day early due to a family emergency, and drove away from the cabin. But instead of leaving the area, she parked at a coffee shop in the nearest town and used their Wi-Fi to contact local police. When officers initially seemed skeptical about her story, Sarah showed them the photos and videos she'd taken of the surveillance equipment and notebook entries. The police took her report seriously and obtained a warrant to search the property. What they found was far worse than even Sarah had discovered. David had converted the cabin's basement into a sophisticated surveillance control room with multiple monitors showing live feeds from cameras throughout the property. He had thousands of hours of footage stored on hard drives, organized by guest and labeled with disturbing categories. Police also found evidence that David owned several other properties in different states, all equipped with similar surveillance systems, suggesting Sarah had stumbled upon a much larger operation targeting vulnerable travelers across the country. Story 2. Underground Rules. When Jake Morrison and his 3 college roommates decided to split a cheap Airbnb in Detroit for their spring break road trip, they thought they'd struck gold finding a basement apartment for just $35 per night. The listing was sparse on details, showing only a few photos of basic furnishings and a simple description. Cozy basement unit, perfect for budget travelers. House rules must be followed strictly for everyone's safety. The host, Margaret Kellner, had decent reviews, though several mentioned her being particular about rules and strict about noise after dark. Jake's group didn't mind. They were planning to spend most of their time exploring the city anyway, and the money they saved on accommodation meant more cash for concerts and restaurants. When they arrived at the modest 2-story house on a quiet residential street, Margaret met them at a side entrance that led directly to the basement, explaining that she lived upstairs and preferred to keep the spaces separate. She was a thin, nervous woman in her 60s who spoke in quick, clipped sentences and kept glancing at her watch as if she was anxious for them to get inside quickly. Margaret handed Jake a laminated sheet of house rules, emphasizing that these weren't suggestions but absolute requirements for staying in her property. The rules seemed oddly specific. No noise above a whisper after 8 p.m., all lights must be turned off by 9 p.m., no one was allowed upstairs under any circumstances, and most strangely, everyone must remain in the main living area between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. No wandering around the basement alone during those hours. When Jake's roommate Tyler asked about the bathroom situation during night hours, Margaret's face tightened and she repeated that the main living area rule was non-negotiable, pointing to a small half bathroom visible from the central couch area. She also mentioned that she sometimes had maintenance issues that required loud machinery at night, so they shouldn't be concerned if they heard unusual sounds from within the walls or ceiling. Margaret collected their payment in cash only, despite the listing indicating she accepted digital payments, and made each of them verbally confirm they understood and would follow the rules before handing over a key. The basement apartment was more cramped than the photos had suggested, with low ceilings, small windows near the ceiling that barely let in natural light, and a musty smell that Margaret claimed was just typical basement dampness. The main living area contained a sectional couch, small TV, and mini fridge, while 2 tiny bedrooms branched off from either side. The bathroom, Margaret had pointed out, was indeed positioned where it could be seen from the main seating area, offering no real privacy. Jake's friends, Tyler, Marcus, and David, joked about the weird rules and Margaret's intense demeanor, but they were exhausted from driving all day and just wanted to settle. They ordered pizza, watched TV, and went to bed early, with Jake and Tyler sharing one bedroom while Marcus and David took the other. Everything seemed normal until around 11 p.m., when they heard the first sounds coming from inside the walls. The noises started as a low humming, almost like machinery, which matched what Margaret had warned them about. But as the night progressed, the sounds became more complex and disturbing. There were rhythmic scraping noises, like something heavy being dragged across a floor above them, followed by what sounded distinctly like muffled voices having a conversation. Jake tried to convince himself it was just Margaret watching late-night TV, but the voices seemed to be coming from multiple directions within the walls themselves, not from the upstairs apartment. Around 2 a.m., David whispered that he needed to use the bathroom, but when he started to get up, Tyler grabbed his arm and reminded him about the rule requiring everyone to stay in the main area. They had all been sleeping in the living room anyway since the bedrooms felt claustrophobically small, so David reluctantly used the half bath while the others tried to ignore the awkwardness of the situation. The second night, the sounds escalated significantly. Along with the mechanical humming and scraping, they began hearing what sounded unmistakably like footsteps moving through spaces within the walls, not above them in Margaret's apartment, but literally inside the structure around them. Marcus, who was studying architecture, pointed out that the basement's layout didn't make structural sense. The walls seemed thicker than necessary, and there were areas where the room dimensions didn't match what should be possible given the house's foundation. Around midnight, they heard something that made them all freeze in terror, the distinct sound of someone crying coming from somewhere behind the wall that separated their living area from what should have been solid earth. The crying continued for over an hour, sometimes getting closer, sometimes fading, as if someone was moving through hidden passages within the walls themselves. Jake decided to investigate during daylight hours while Margaret was away. Using a flashlight app on his phone, he examined the basement walls more carefully and discovered several irregularities that confirmed Marcus's architectural suspicions. There were sections where the drywall looked newer than others, subtle differences in paint color, and, most tellingly, small holes near the baseboards that looked like they might be for ventilation. In one corner, Jake found a section of wall that sounded hollow when tapped, completely different from the solid concrete sound elsewhere. When he pressed against it, the wall actually gave slightly, as if it was just a false panel rather than a structural element. That evening, Jake shared his discoveries with the others, and they decided to confront Margaret about the strange layout and nocturnal sounds. Margaret's reaction to their questions was immediate and intense panic. She became agitated, speaking rapidly about how they needed to follow the rules exactly, or everyone would be in danger. When pressed about the crying sounds and wall irregularities, Margaret broke down and admitted that the basement had previous tenants, who had housing arrangements that required the current setup. She revealed that several homeless individuals were living in hidden spaces within the basement's walls, spaces she had constructed over the years to house people who had nowhere else to go. What Margaret described as charity work, however, became increasingly sinister as she explained the arrangement. The people in the walls were not free to leave. They worked for her during the day doing various tasks around the neighborhood, and in exchange she provided them with food and shelter in the cramped wall spaces. The truth was far more horrifying than Margaret's sanitized explanation suggested. Jake and his friends discovered that Margaret was essentially running a human trafficking operation, keeping vulnerable people trapped in the walls and forcing them to work while she collected money from various sources: government assistance, charity organizations, and rental income from unsuspecting Airbnb guests. The people in the walls were not there voluntarily. They were individuals Margaret had found in desperate situations and gradually manipulated into dependence through a combination of drugs, threats, and psychological manipulation. She used the rental income from college students and other short-term guests to fund this operation, specifically targeting young people who were unlikely to ask too many questions or cause problems if they heard strange sounds. The crying they had heard was from a young woman named Elena, who had been trapped in the wall system for over 2 years after Margaret had rescued her from an abusive relationship, only to trap her in an even worse situation. Elena and 4 others were living in a network of hidden rooms and crawlways that Margaret had constructed within the basement's walls, spaces so narrow and low that the occupants could barely stand upright. They were forced to remain absolutely silent during the day when guests might be present, and were only allowed out to work or use bathroom facilities during specific night hours when Margaret could monitor them. The maintenance sounds were actually the trapped individuals trying to communicate with each other or attempting to escape their confined spaces. The most terrifying aspect of Margaret's operation was how she selected certain Airbnb guests as potential new residents for her wall system. She had been evaluating Jake's group since their arrival, looking for signs of financial desperation, social isolation, or other vulnerabilities that might make them suitable for recruitment. Margaret had planned to approach one of them, specifically Tyler, who had mentioned during check-in that he was struggling financially and had no family support, with an offer of permanent housing in exchange for work. Her method was to gradually introduce the idea over multiple stays, building trust and dependence before revealing the true nature of the arrangement and making it impossible for victims to leave. Jake and his friends managed to escape the house and contact police, but not before discovering the full scope of Margaret's operation. The basement contained not just the hidden rooms where people were currently trapped, but also evidence of previous victims who had died in captivity due to the horrific living conditions. Police found medical records showing that Margaret had been forging documents to collect government benefits for people who were either dead or trapped in her basement, creating a complex fraud scheme that had been operating for over a decade. The investigation revealed that Margaret owned multiple properties throughout the Midwest, all with similar basement prison systems, and had been moving her trapped victims between locations to avoid detection while simultaneously running Airbnb operations to fund and provide cover for her human trafficking network. Story 3. The Previous Guest. When Rebecca and Tom Chen booked a romantic weekend getaway at a charming Victorian bed and breakfast in Salem, Massachusetts, they were looking forward to disconnecting from their stressful jobs and reconnecting with each other. The Airbnb listing showcased a beautifully restored 1800s home with period furnishings, antique decor, and a cozy atmosphere perfect for their 5-year anniversary celebration. The host, Eleanor Whitmore, was a local historian who had converted her family's ancestral home into a boutique accommodation, maintaining its authentic character while adding modern amenities. Eleanor's reviews consistently praised her attention to historical detail and her knowledge of Salem's rich past, with many guests commenting on her fascinating stories about the house's history and the various families who had lived there over the centuries. At $180 per night, it was a splurge for the young couple, but Tom had recently received a promotion and wanted to celebrate properly. Eleanor greeted them Friday evening with homemade apple cider and a brief tour of the house, pointing out original features like hand-hewn wooden beams, antique wallpaper, and period furniture that had belonged to previous generations of her family. She explained that their room, the Rose Suite, had been her great-grandmother's bedroom and contained many original pieces from the 1920s, including an ornate vanity table, a cedar hope chest, and a 4-poster bed with hand-carved details. Eleanor mentioned that she lived in a separate wing of the house and would be available if they needed anything, but otherwise would give them complete privacy to enjoy their romantic weekend. She provided them with a key to their room and another for the main house, explaining that she sometimes went out of town and they might need access to common areas when she wasn't present. The Rose Suite was everything the photos had promised: elegant, romantic, and filled with period charm that made Rebecca feel like she had stepped back in time. The room featured rich burgundy wallpaper with gold accents, heavy velvet curtains, and antique oil paintings of stern-looking ancestors watching from ornate frames. Tom particularly admired the craftsmanship of the furniture, especially the hand-carved hope chest at the foot of the bed, which Eleanor had mentioned contained extra blankets and pillows for guests' use. They spent their first evening exploring the room's details, taking photos of the vintage decor, and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere that felt worlds away from their busy city lives. Rebecca even posted an Instagram story showcasing the beautiful vanity table, writing, "Living my Victorian fantasy this weekend." Saturday morning brought their first unsettling discovery. While Rebecca was getting ready at the antique vanity, she noticed something that seemed out of place among the period-appropriate items Eleanor had carefully arranged. Behind an ornate hand mirror, partially hidden by a small jewelry box, was a modern smartphone charger cable. When Rebecca pulled it out to examine it, she found it was an iPhone charger, the kind with a lightning connector that was only a few years old. The cable was dusty but not ancient, suggesting it had been there for months rather than years. When she showed Tom, they both found it odd that Eleanor would leave modern electronics mixed in with authentic antique accessories, especially since she seemed so particular about maintaining the room's historical accuracy in every other detail. Curious about the out-of-place charger, Rebecca decided to look more carefully through the room's furnishings to see if there were other modern items that didn't belong. In the hope chest, beneath the neatly folded extra blankets Eleanor had mentioned, Rebecca discovered something that made her heart race. There was a small collection of personal items that clearly didn't belong to the bed and breakfast. A pair of women's sunglasses, a lipstick in a contemporary tube, a small bottle of expensive perfume that was still half full, and, most disturbing of all, a driver's license belonging to someone named Amanda Foster from Boston. The license photo showed a young woman about Rebecca's age with dark hair and a bright smile, and the issue date indicated it was current and valid. Rebecca immediately showed Tom, and they both realized that these weren't historical artifacts or forgotten items that Eleanor had simply overlooked while preparing the room for new guests. Tom suggested they ask Eleanor about the items, thinking there might be an innocent explanation. Perhaps Amanda had been a recent guest who forgot some belongings and Eleanor was holding them for her return. However, when they went downstairs to find Eleanor, they discovered she had left for the day, with a note on the kitchen counter explaining she was visiting relatives and would return Sunday evening. The note encouraged them to make themselves at home and explore the house's common areas, including the library and sitting room where she kept photo albums documenting the house's history and previous guests. With Eleanor unavailable for questioning, Rebecca and Tom decided to investigate further on their own, starting with the guest photo albums to see if they could find any trace of Amanda Foster among previous visitors. The photo albums in the library were meticulously organized, with pictures of guests dating back several years, each carefully labeled with names and dates of their stays. Rebecca methodically went through each album while Tom examined other areas of the house, looking for any photos or mentions of Amanda Foster. What Rebecca found was disturbing. There were multiple photos of a woman who looked exactly like the Amanda Foster from the driver's license, but the photos spanned different time periods over the past year and showed her in various outfits and seasons. In some photos, Amanda appeared to be enjoying typical bed and breakfast activities, having breakfast, reading in the garden, posing in front of the house. But other photos seemed more candid and intimate, showing Amanda in casual moments like sleeping, bathing, or changing clothes, as if someone had been photographing her without her knowledge or consent. Tom made an even more chilling discovery while exploring the house's basement, which Eleanor had mentioned contained historical artifacts and storage for the bed and breakfast. In a corner of the basement, behind stacks of antique furniture and old trunks, Tom found what appeared to be a makeshift living space. There was a mattress on the floor, some basic toiletries, several changes of women's clothing in sizes that would fit Amanda Foster, and, most horrifying of all, a collection of restraints including handcuffs, rope, and chains, attached to one of the basement's support beams. The area smelled of human occupancy and showed clear signs of recent use. Food wrappers, water bottles, and personal hygiene items that couldn't have been there for more than a few weeks. Tom also found a journal written in a woman's handwriting, detailing daily experiences of being held captive in the basement by Eleanor, who apparently believed that certain guests were meant to become permanent residents of the house. The journal entries, written by Amanda Foster over a period of several months, revealed the horrifying truth about Eleanor's bed and breakfast operation. Amanda had originally booked a romantic weekend stay with her boyfriend the previous fall, similar to Rebecca and Tom's current visit. However, something had gone wrong during their stay. Amanda's boyfriend had left suddenly after an argument, abandoning Amanda at the bed and breakfast without transportation back to Boston. Eleanor had offered to help Amanda get home, but instead had drugged her and moved her to the basement prison, convincing Amanda that her boyfriend had reported her missing and that police were looking for her in connection with some fabricated crime. Eleanor used psychological manipulation and physical restraints to keep Amanda trapped, gradually convincing her that the outside world believed she was dead and that her only safety lay in remaining hidden in the basement. Amanda's journal entries described Eleanor's twisted belief system, which centered around the idea that the house chose certain guests to become permanent residents and join the spirits of previous occupants. Eleanor claimed that the house's long history of deaths and tragedies had created spiritual energy that demanded living occupants to maintain balance between the past and present. She told Amanda that she had been selected by the house's spirits and that attempting to leave would result in supernatural punishment for both of them. Eleanor reinforced these beliefs by creating fake evidence that Amanda's disappearance had caused devastating consequences for her family and friends, showing her fabricated news articles about search efforts and false social media posts, suggesting that Amanda's loved ones blamed themselves for her disappearance. The most recent journal entries revealed that Eleanor was planning to select new permanent residents from upcoming guests, and Amanda had been forced to help identify potential candidates by observing them through hidden cameras throughout the house. Amanda wrote about her horror at watching Eleanor evaluate Rebecca and Tom during their stay, noting how Eleanor paid particular attention to Rebecca's physical appearance and personality traits, comparing her to criteria Amanda didn't fully understand but knew were part of Eleanor's selection process. The final entry, dated just 2 days before Rebecca and Tom's arrival, described Amanda's failed escape attempt and Eleanor's punishment, which involved threats to harm Rebecca and Tom if Amanda tried to leave or alert them to the situation. Rebecca and Tom realized they were in immediate danger and that Amanda was likely still somewhere in the house, possibly in another hidden location they hadn't discovered. They attempted to call police but found that their cell phones had no signal and the house's landline had been disconnected. When they tried to leave the property with their car, they discovered that Eleanor had somehow disabled their vehicle while they were exploring the house. The engine wouldn't start and appeared to have been sabotaged. As evening approached and Eleanor's scheduled return time drew near, Rebecca and Tom frantically searched for Amanda while planning their own escape. They eventually found her in a hidden room behind a false wall in the basement, barely conscious and in desperate need of medical attention after months of captivity and malnutrition. The three of them managed to escape on foot through the woods behind the house, eventually reaching a neighbor's property where they could call for help. Police investigation revealed that Eleanor Whitmore had been operating her twisted captivity scheme for over a decade, with Amanda being only the most recent victim in a series of missing persons cases that had been attributed to people voluntarily disappearing or meeting with accidents during their travels. Eleanor had developed sophisticated methods for selecting victims, disabling their transportation, and creating false narratives about why they couldn't return to their normal lives. The house itself was discovered to contain multiple hidden rooms and restraint systems throughout different floors, suggesting that Eleanor had been holding multiple victims simultaneously at various times, all while continuing to operate a legitimate bed and breakfast business that provided perfect cover for her crimes. Story 4. Host's Little Helper. Dr. Lisa Hammond thought she had found the perfect solution to her work travel problem when she booked a month-long stay at a cozy apartment in Portland, Oregon, during her medical research fellowship at OHSU. The Airbnb listing promised a quiet, professional environment ideal for long-term stays, with a dedicated workspace, high-speed internet, and a host who understood the needs of medical professionals. The host, Dr. Richard Voss, claimed to be a retired physician who had converted his property into accommodations specifically for visiting medical staff, researchers, and other healthcare workers. His profile was impressive. medical degree from Johns Hopkins, decades of practice in internal medicine, and glowing reviews from previous guests who were doctors, nurses, and medical students. At $95 per night for a month-long stay, it was within Lisa's fellowship budget and seemed perfect for her needs while she completed her research on sleep disorders and neurological function. Dr. Voss met Lisa at the apartment on a rainy Sunday evening, immediately putting her at ease with his professional demeanor and medical credentials displayed prominently in the entryway. He was a distinguished-looking man in his mid-60s with silver hair and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being trusted with people's lives. During the tour, he pointed out features specifically designed for medical professionals: a quiet study area with medical references, reliable internet for teleconferences, and even a small refrigerator he said was perfect for storing any medications or research samples she might need to keep cold. Dr. Voss mentioned that he lived in the main house next door and was always available if she had any medical emergencies or professional needs, emphasizing his understanding of the demanding schedule and stress that came with medical research work. The apartment exceeded Lisa's expectations in every way. It was immaculately clean, professionally furnished, and positioned in a quiet neighborhood that allowed her to focus completely on her research without distractions. Dr. Voss had even stocked the kitchen with healthy meal options and left a welcome basket containing high-quality vitamins, herbal teas, and what he described as natural sleep aids to help her adjust to the new time zone and maintain her energy during her intensive research schedule. Lisa was particularly grateful for his thoughtfulness since she had been struggling with insomnia and stress-related fatigue during her fellowship program. She established a productive routine of working at the apartment during the day, attending research sessions at the hospital, and returning to the quiet space each evening to analyze data and write up her findings. However, after the first week, Lisa began experiencing some concerning symptoms that seemed inconsistent with her usual health patterns. Despite getting what felt like adequate sleep each night, she was waking up feeling groggy and disoriented, with a heavy, drugged sensation that took hours to clear. Initially, she attributed this to stress and the demanding nature of her research work, but the symptoms were getting progressively worse rather than better as she adjusted to her new routine. Lisa also noticed that her memory seemed foggy in the mornings. She had trouble remembering details from the previous evening, and sometimes found items in her apartment moved or rearranged in ways she couldn't explain. Most disturbing was the discovery of small bruises and needle marks on her arms that she couldn't account for, particularly around her inner elbows where blood draws typically occurred. As a medical professional, Lisa recognized these symptoms as potentially indicating that she was being drugged, but the idea seemed paranoid and unlikely given her secure living situation with a fellow physician. However, her training told her to trust her clinical instincts, so she began documenting her symptoms and looking for patterns. She noticed that the grogginess and memory issues were worst on nights when she consumed the herbal tea that Dr. Voss had provided, and that the mysterious bruises appeared most frequently after particularly deep sleep episodes. Lisa decided to secretly test her theory by avoiding the tea and other items Dr. Voss had given her, instead bringing her own food and drinks from outside sources. On nights when she avoided Dr. Voss's provisions, her symptoms significantly decreased, confirming her suspicions that something in his welcoming gifts was causing her problems. Lisa's medical background allowed her to recognize the signs of systematic drugging, but she needed concrete evidence before confronting Dr. Voss or involving authorities. She secretly collected samples of the herbal tea and vitamins he had provided and arranged to have them tested by a colleague at the hospital's toxicology lab, using her research credentials to gain access without raising questions. The results were horrifying. The tea contained high levels of benzodiazepines and other sedatives that would render someone unconscious for hours, while the vitamins were laced with muscle relaxants and substances that would impair memory formation. The combination was clearly designed to keep someone in a deep, unnatural sleep while remaining vulnerable to whatever someone might want to do to them during their unconscious state. Armed with this evidence, Lisa installed a hidden camera in her bedroom using a small device designed for home security, positioning it to record what happened while she slept. She pretended to consume the drugged tea as usual, but secretly disposed of it, instead taking a mild over-the-counter sleep aid to appear normally asleep while remaining conscious enough to be awakened by unusual sounds or activity. What the camera captured over the next several nights was beyond Lisa's worst fears. Dr. Voss was entering her apartment in E92 the early morning hours, using a key she hadn't known he possessed, and conducting unauthorized medical procedures on her unconscious body. The footage showed him drawing blood samples, performing physical examinations, administering unknown injections, and even conducting what appeared to be minor surgical procedures while she was unconscious from his drugs. The video evidence revealed that Dr. Voss was using Lisa and presumably other medical professional guests as unwilling test subjects for his own research projects. His medical license may have been legitimate, but he was conducting illegal human experimentation using the cover of his Airbnb operation to access vulnerable subjects who trusted him based on his credentials. The procedures he was performing were clearly part of some ongoing study, as he meticulously documented everything and collected extensive biological samples. Lisa realized that his preference for hosting medical professionals wasn't just about understanding their needs. It was because they were ideal test subjects who were less likely to seek medical attention for minor, unexplained symptoms, assuming that stress and work demands were responsible for any health issues they experienced. Further investigation into Dr. Voss's background revealed that his medical license had actually been suspended several years earlier due to ethics violations related to unauthorized research, but he had continued operating under the radar by targeting transient populations who wouldn't be in one place long enough to establish patterns or seek consistent medical care. His Airbnb operation provided the perfect cover for accessing healthy, educated subjects who trusted him implicitly due to his medical credentials and professional presentation. Lisa discovered that several previous guests had reported similar symptoms in their reviews: morning grogginess, memory issues, and unexplained fatigue, but had attributed these to travel stress or work demands rather than recognizing them as signs of being drugged and violated. The most terrifying aspect of Dr. Voss's operation was the sophistication of his research setup. Lisa found evidence that he had converted parts of his main house into a full medical laboratory where he processed the biological samples he collected from unconscious guests. He was conducting research on sleep patterns, neurological responses, and pharmaceutical effects using data gathered from his non-consenting human subjects. His research appeared to be focused on developing new sedatives and memory-suppressing drugs, using his guests as test subjects for various combinations of substances to measure their effectiveness and side effects. Some of the compounds he was testing were experimental drugs not approved for human use, making his victims unwitting participants in potentially dangerous medical trials. Lisa contacted authorities and provided them with the video evidence, toxicology reports, and documentation of Dr. Voss's suspended medical license. The investigation revealed that his illegal research operation had been running for over 3 years, with dozens of medical professionals having unknowingly served as test subjects during their stays at his property. Many victims had suffered long-term health consequences from the experimental drugs they had been given, including permanent memory issues, neurological damage, and compromised immune systems. Dr. Voss had been selling his research data to pharmaceutical companies and other parties interested in developing new sedatives and interrogation drugs, making substantial profits from his non-consensual human experimentation. The case exposed a horrifying intersection of medical ethics violations and hospitality industry exploitation, where trust in professional credentials had been weaponized to facilitate systematic abuse of vulnerable travelers seeking temporary housing. Story 5. Family Tradition. The Hartwell family thought they had discovered the perfect mountain retreat when they booked a week-long stay at the Ashwood Lodge in rural Vermont for their annual summer vacation. Parents Michael and Jennifer were looking for a digital detox opportunity for themselves and their two teenage children, Emma and Luke, hoping to reconnect as a family away from the constant distractions of modern life. The listing described a rustic lodge built in the 1800s, surrounded by pristine wilderness with hiking trails, a private lake, and no cell phone coverage to ensure complete relaxation. The host family, the Corbins, had owned the property for generations and marketed it as an authentic experience of traditional mountain living, complete with home-cooked meals, storytelling by the fireplace, and guided nature walks. At $300 per night for the entire lodge, it was expensive, but seemed worth it for the unique experience and the chance to have the property completely to themselves for a full week. The Corbin family greeted the Hartwells upon their arrival with overwhelming hospitality that immediately put them at ease. Patriarch Samuel Corbin, a weathered man in his 70s with piercing blue eyes and calloused hands, welcomed them with the kind of genuine warmth that seemed increasingly rare in their urban lives. His wife, Martha, a soft-spoken woman who moved with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing large households, had prepared a feast of local specialties, including venison, fresh vegetables from their garden, and homemade bread that filled the lodge with intoxicating aromas. Their adult children, David, Sarah, and Thomas, along with several grandchildren, all participated in making the Hartwells feel like honored guests rather than paying customers. The multi-generational family dynamic created an atmosphere of authentic mountain hospitality that exceeded every expectation the Hartwells had formed based on the online listing. Samuel Corbin regaled them with fascinating stories about the lodge's history during their first evening together, explaining how his great-great-grandfather had built the structure as a hunting lodge in 1847 and how it had remained in the family ever since. He described the various famous guests who had stayed there over the decades, writers, politicians, and wealthy industrialists who had come seeking the same escape from civilization that the Hartwells were enjoying. Martha served them her special herbal tea blend, made from plants she gathered herself in the surrounding mountains, explaining that the recipe had been passed down through generations of Corbin women and was said to have healing properties that would help them sleep deeply and wake refreshed. The children were fascinated by the lodge's antique furnishings, oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, and the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room, while Michael and Jennifer appreciated the complete absence of modern distractions that forced their family to actually talk to each other for the first time in months. The second day brought their first exposure to what Samuel described as family traditions that made the Ashwood Lodge experience unique. He explained that the Corbins had maintained certain customs for over a century, practices that connected them to their ancestors and the spiritual energy of the mountain. These traditions included daily sunrise prayers at a stone circle hidden deep in the woods, evening ceremonies involving the burning of specific herbs that were sacred to their family, and the sharing of stories about their ancestors who had lived on this land for generations. Samuel invited the Hartwells to participate in these traditions, describing them as a rare opportunity to experience authentic mountain culture that had been preserved unchanged for decades. Jennifer was particularly interested in the herbal knowledge that Martha possessed, while Michael appreciated the historical continuity that the Corbins represented in an increasingly modernized world. However, Emma began noticing disturbing elements in the family traditions that the adults seemed to overlook or dismiss. During the sunrise prayer ceremony, she observed that the stone circle contained markings that looked less like traditional Christian symbols and more like something much older and more sinister. The prayers themselves, while Samuel claimed they were based on colonial-era Christianity, contained phrases in what sounded like Latin mixed with words Emma didn't recognize, creating an atmosphere that felt more like ritual incantation than simple morning devotion. Martha's herbal ceremonies involved burning plants that produced smoke with psychoactive properties, causing participants to experience altered states of consciousness that Martha claimed were necessary for connecting with ancestral spirits. Emma also noticed that the family portraits throughout the lodge depicted people whose eyes seemed to follow observers around the room, and that many of the faces bore disturbing similarities despite representing different generations spanning over a century. Luke made an even more unsettling discovery while exploring the lodge's extensive basement, which Samuel had mentioned contained historical artifacts and preserved items from previous generations. Hidden behind stacks of old furniture and covered by dusty tarps, Luke found what appeared to be an altar surrounded by dozens of photographs of previous guests who had stayed at the lodge over the years. The photographs were arranged in a precise pattern around carved wooden figurines and metal objects that looked like ceremonial tools rather than typical household items. Most disturbing was a collection of personal items, jewelry, clothing, and other belongings that clearly didn't belong to the Corbin family but seemed to have been taken from guests and arranged as offerings around the altar. Luke, also, discovered journals written in multiple handwritings, documenting experiences of previous guests who described feeling increasingly unwell during their stays, experiencing vivid nightmares, and having difficulty remembering details about their time at the lodge. The journals revealed a pattern of guests arriving as normal families or individuals seeking vacation experiences, but gradually becoming confused, disoriented, and compliant as their stays progressed. Many entries described feeling compelled to participate in the Corbin family traditions despite initial reservations, and experiencing a growing sense that they belonged at the lodge permanently rather than returning to their regular lives. Several journals contained final entries expressing the writers' decisions to extend their stays indefinitely, abandoning jobs, schools, and other responsibilities to become part of the Corbin family's spiritual community. The most recent journal entries were dated from just 2 months earlier and belonged to a family called the Hendersons, who had apparently arrived for a weekend stay but never left the property. Emma and Luke shared their discoveries with their parents, but found that Michael and Jennifer seemed strangely reluctant to take their concerns seriously. Their parents had been consuming Martha's herbal tea daily and participating enthusiastically in all the family traditions, gradually becoming more accepting of the Corbins' explanations for increasingly bizarre customs. When Emma suggested they should leave early, Jennifer dismissed her concerns as teenage drama and insisted they were having the authentic mountain experience they had hoped for. Michael had become particularly close to Samuel, spending hours discussing the lodge's history and expressing genuine interest in the Corbin family's way of life. Both parents seemed to be losing their normal skepticism and critical thinking abilities, becoming more passive and agreeable with each passing day at the lodge. The truth about the Corbin family traditions became clear when Emma secretly followed the family during one of their nighttime ceremonies. Deep in the woods, at a much larger stone circle than the one used for morning prayers, the Corbins conducted rituals that had nothing to do with Christianity or traditional mountain culture. The ceremonies involved elaborate preparations using human remains that the family had collected over generations, including bones, hair, and other biological materials taken from previous guests who had stayed at the lodge. The Corbins believed that by incorporating these human elements into their rituals, they could absorb the life energy and memories of their victims, maintaining their own vitality and extending their lives far beyond normal human spans. The family members who Emma had assumed were different generations were actually much older than they appeared, having used their ritualistic practices to maintain youthful appearances for decades, while their true ages extended back over a century. The Corbins' operation involved systematically drugging guests with psychoactive herbs that made them susceptible to psychological manipulation, gradually convincing them to abandon their outside lives and join the family's ritualistic community. Guests who resisted or became suspicious were sacrificed during the ceremonies, with their remains incorporated into future rituals and their disappearances attributed to hiking accidents or voluntary decisions to start new lives elsewhere. The lodge's remote location and the family's reputation for hospitality provided perfect cover for their activities, as missing persons investigations rarely focused on places where people had explicitly gone to disconnect from technology and outside contact. The Corbins had been operating this system for over a century, with each generation maintaining the traditions and adding new victims to their ritualistic collection. Emma managed to escape the lodge during the night and reach a neighboring property where she could contact authorities, but not before witnessing the beginning of a ceremony that would have permanently claimed her family as the Corbins' latest victims. Police investigation revealed that the Ashwood Lodge had been the site of dozens of disappearances over the decades, with missing persons cases dating back to the early 1900s, all connected to people who had last been seen traveling to the remote Vermont mountains. The basement altar contained remains from over 50 individuals, while the family's journals documented their ritualistic practices in horrifying detail, including specific methods for drugging guests, breaking down their psychological resistance, and incorporating their biological materials into ceremonies designed to extend the Corbins' unnatural lifespans. The case exposed how isolated hospitality businesses could operate as hunting grounds for predatory families, using the trust associated with traditional hospitality to mask systematic murder and ritualistic abuse that had continued unchecked for generations. Story 6. The Collector's Prize. Marketing executive Catherine Walsh had become a creature of habit during her frequent business travels, always booking accommodations through the same platforms and preferring hosts who understood the needs of professional travelers. Over the past year, she had developed a particularly positive relationship with a host named Marcus Rivera, who operated several properties across different cities where Catherine's company had regional offices. Marcus seemed to anticipate her preferences perfectly: quiet locations suitable for after-hours work, reliable Wi-Fi, well-stocked kitchens for busy professionals who preferred eating in, and, most importantly, properties available on short notice when her travel plans changed suddenly due to client demands. His listings were consistently well-reviewed, reasonably priced, and located in safe neighborhoods that allowed Catherine to focus on her work rather than worrying about her accommodations. What impressed her most was Marcus's attention to detail and his apparent understanding of her specific needs without her having to explain them repeatedly. Catherine first encountered Marcus's properties during a business trip to Chicago, where she had booked a last-minute stay at his downtown apartment after her original hotel reservation fell through due to a convention booking error. Marcus had been incredibly accommodating, responding to her urgent booking request within minutes and providing detailed instructions for accessing the property, even though it was late evening. The apartment was perfectly suited to her needs: modern furnishings, a dedicated workspace with proper lighting, and a kitchen stocked with exactly the type of healthy meal options she preferred during stressful work trips. Marcus had even left a welcome note with recommendations for nearby restaurants that catered to dietary restrictions she had mentioned in her booking inquiry. When Catherine left a glowing review praising his professionalism and attention to detail, Marcus responded with gratitude and an invitation to stay at his other properties if her work brought her to different cities. Over the following months, Catherine found herself booking with Marcus regularly, as her job required travel to various metropolitan areas where he happened to have properties. Whether she needed accommodations in Denver, Seattle, Atlanta, or Phoenix, Marcus always seemed to have the perfect option available precisely when she needed it. His properties were remarkably consistent in their quality and layout, each featuring similar modern aesthetics, professional-grade work setups, and thoughtful touches that made Catherine's business trips more productive and comfortable. Marcus had clearly studied the needs of business travelers and designed his properties specifically to cater to professionals like herself, who spent significant time working from temporary accommodations. Catherine began to rely on Marcus's properties as her primary lodging option, appreciating the consistency and reliability that allowed her to focus on her demanding work schedule rather than worrying about the quality of her accommodations. What Catherine didn't initially notice was how precisely Marcus's properties seemed to match not just her professional needs, but her personal preferences and lifestyle habits in ways that went beyond typical host considerations. Each property contained the same brands of toiletries she used at home, kitchen supplies that matched her specific cooking equipment, and even entertainment options that aligned perfectly with her personal interests. The bedroom setups were identical to her home arrangement, with similar pillow configurations, blanket types, and even room temperatures that matched her preferred sleeping environment exactly. Marcus always seemed to have properties available during her exact travel windows, often in neighborhoods she had mentioned enjoying during previous stays, and his pricing remained consistently reasonable despite high demand in the business districts where Catherine needed to stay. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came during Catherine's stay in Portland, when she discovered items in the apartment that she recognized as belonging to her personally. In the bathroom medicine cabinet, behind some standard toiletries, she found her prescription allergy medication, the same brand, dosage, and pharmacy label that she used at home. When she checked the bedroom dresser for extra blankets, Catherine found several pieces of her own clothing, including a distinctive sweater she had been looking for at home and a pair of earrings she thought she had lost during a previous business trip. Most disturbing was finding her personal journal, which she was certain she had left at home, sitting on the nightstand as if it belonged in the apartment. The journal contained private thoughts, work frustrations, and personal reflections that no one else should have had access to, yet here it was in Marcus's property as if it were part of the standard amenities. Catherine's discovery prompted her to examine Marcus's other properties more carefully during subsequent stays, and she found increasingly disturbing evidence that he had been systematically studying and replicating her personal living environment. In his Seattle property, she found photographs of her home's interior displayed as artwork on the walls, pictures that showed her private living spaces in detail, including her bedroom, home office, and kitchen. Marcus had somehow gained access to her personal residence and documented every aspect of her living arrangements, from furniture placement to personal belongings organization. In his Denver property, Catherine discovered that Marcus had recreated her home office setup exactly, including the same desk accessories, computer monitor arrangement, and even personal photos that should have been in her actual home office. The most terrifying realization came when Catherine found Marcus's detailed documentation of her daily routines, personal relationships, and private activities. Hidden in what appeared to be a decorative storage box, she discovered extensive files containing information about her work schedule, client meetings, personal relationships, medical history, and even transcripts of private phone calls she had made from his properties. Marcus had been recording her conversations and monitoring her activities during every stay, building a comprehensive profile that went far beyond normal host interactions. The files included psychological analysis of her personality, detailed tracking of her sleep patterns and eating habits, and even speculation about her emotional state and personal relationships based on observations made during her stays at his properties. Catherine realized that Marcus had been using his network of properties to create an elaborate stalking operation that allowed him to monitor and control her life while appearing to provide legitimate hospitality services. His multiple properties weren't coincidentally located in cities where she needed to travel. He had been manipulating her work assignments and travel requirements through subtle interference with her company's booking systems and client communications. Marcus had gained access to her professional email accounts and was subtly influencing her business travel by creating situations that required her presence in cities where he operated properties. He had also been gradually isolating her from alternative accommodation options by creating fake negative reviews for other properties and ensuring his listings appeared most prominently when she searched for lodging. The scope of Marcus's operation extended far beyond simple surveillance and manipulation. Catherine discovered that he had been gradually taking control of various aspects of her life by intercepting her mail, accessing her financial accounts, and even impersonating her in communications with friends and family members to create the impression that she was becoming increasingly isolated and dependent on her work-travel lifestyle. Marcus had been systematically removing people and opportunities from her life while positioning himself as the only reliable constant in her increasingly unstable personal situation. His ultimate goal appeared to be convincing Catherine that her life outside of his controlled environment was chaotic and unsatisfying, making her dependent on the stability and comfort he provided through his properties. The psychological manipulation Marcus employed was sophisticated and designed to create a trauma bond that would make Catherine unable to imagine traveling or living without his properties as her anchor points. He had been gradually increasing his personal involvement in her stays, starting with simple hospitality gestures and evolving into more intimate interactions that blurred the boundaries between host and guest. Marcus had been studying Catherine's vulnerabilities and insecurities through his surveillance, then creating situations during her stays that would trigger her need for comfort and security, which he would then provide through his attentive hosting. His properties served as both monitoring stations and psychological manipulation environments where he could observe Catherine's responses to different stimuli and adjust his approach to maximize her emotional dependence. Catherine's escape from Marcus's control required careful planning since he had integrated himself so thoroughly into her professional and personal life. She discovered that he had been tracking her location through various means and would know immediately if she booked accommodations elsewhere or changed her travel patterns suddenly. With the help of law enforcement specialists in cyberstalking cases, Catherine was able to document the extent of Marcus's surveillance network and manipulation tactics. The investigation revealed that Marcus operated similar stalking operations targeting several other professional women who traveled frequently for work, using his hospitality business as cover for elaborate psychological manipulation and control schemes. His properties in multiple cities were all connected through sophisticated surveillance systems that allowed him to monitor and manipulate his victims' lives while maintaining the appearance of being a legitimate hospitality provider who simply had an exceptional understanding of his guests' needs. Story 7. No Checkout Policy. Adventure photographer Nathan Cross had specifically chosen the remote Black Pine Mountain Lodge for his solo wilderness photography expedition because of its complete isolation from civilization and its promise of untouched natural beauty. Located deep in the Canadian Rockies, the lodge required a grueling 4-hour drive on increasingly treacherous mountain roads, followed by a final 20-minute hike through dense forest to reach the property. The listing emphasized that guests should come completely prepared for self-sufficiency, as there were no nearby stores, gas stations, or emergency services within 100 miles. Cell phone coverage was non-existent, and the lodge operated on solar power with backup generators, making it perfect for Nathan's goal of spending 2 weeks capturing pristine wilderness photographs without any modern distractions. The host, a man named Willem Bergstrom, described himself as a former park ranger who had built the lodge as a sanctuary for serious outdoor enthusiasts who wanted to experience true wilderness immersion. Willem met Nathan at the designated trailhead parking area, appearing exactly as his profile had suggested, a rugged, bearded man in his 50s with the weathered appearance of someone who had spent decades living in harsh mountain conditions. He helped Nathan carry his extensive photography equipment and camping supplies along the forest trail to the lodge, explaining the property's systems and safety protocols during their hike. Willem emphasized the importance of following strict guidelines for food storage, waste disposal, and fire safety due to the area's wildlife population and extreme fire risk during dry seasons. He also explained that the lodge operated on a minimal intervention philosophy, meaning that guests were expected to be completely self-reliant and that Willem would only be available for true emergencies since he lived in a separate cabin several miles away and checked on the main lodge only weekly during the off-season. The Black Pine Mountain Lodge exceeded Nathan's expectations for rustic wilderness accommodation while still providing the basic amenities needed for an extended stay. The main building was a sturdy log structure with a stone fireplace, well-equipped kitchen, and comfortable sleeping areas that could accommodate up to 8 guests, though Nathan had booked it exclusively for his solo expedition. Large windows provided stunning views of the surrounding peaks and valleys, offering perfect vantage points for sunrise and sunset photography that Nathan planned to incorporate into his wilderness portfolio. Willem had stocked the lodge with emergency supplies, basic medical equipment, and communication devices including a satellite phone that could reach emergency services in case of serious injury or life-threatening situations. The property also featured several outbuildings including a generator shed, equipment storage area, and what Willem described as a root cellar for preserving food during extended stays. Nathan spent his first few days establishing his photography routine and exploring the immediate area around the lodge, documenting the incredible landscapes and wildlife that made this location so special for his artistic work. The isolation was exactly what he had hoped for. Complete silence except for natural sounds, crystal clear air that made distant mountains appear startlingly close, and lighting conditions that changed dramatically throughout each day as weather systems moved through the high-altitude environment. However, Nathan began noticing some details around the lodge that seemed inconsistent with Willem's description of the property's usage and maintenance schedule. Despite being told that he was the first guest of the season and that the lodge had been closed for several months, Nathan found evidence of recent occupancy including fresh food in the refrigerator, recently used bedding in several of the guest rooms, and personal belongings scattered throughout the lodge that clearly didn't belong to Willem. The personal items Nathan discovered suggested that multiple people had been staying at the lodge recently, and their belongings indicated they had been there for extended periods rather than brief wilderness visits. In the main bedroom, he found women's clothing, jewelry, and toiletries that appeared to have been abandoned suddenly rather than packed up after a completed stay. The kitchen contained partially used groceries with expiration dates indicating they had been purchased within the past few weeks, and the refrigerator held leftover meals that suggested recent meal preparation by people who had intended to stay longer. Most disturbing was Nathan's discovery of personal identification documents, driver's licenses, credit cards, and passports, belonging to different individuals and hidden throughout various drawers and storage areas as if someone had been collecting them rather than accidentally leaving them behind. Nathan's growing unease intensified when he found a guest logbook that contained entries from people who had supposedly stayed at the lodge over the past 2 years, but whose departure dates seemed suspicious or inconsistent. Many guests had written about planning to extend their stays indefinitely, expressing how the wilderness experience had changed their perspectives on their previous lives and their desire to disconnect permanently from modern society. Several entries mentioned Willem's wisdom and guidance in helping them understand that they belonged in the wilderness rather than returning to their complicated urban lives. The most recent entries were particularly disturbing, describing guests who had arrived for short wilderness retreats but had decided to abandon their jobs, relationships, and responsibilities to become permanent residents of the mountain wilderness under Willem's mentorship. When Nathan attempted to use the satellite phone to check in with his photography clients and confirm his planned departure date, he discovered that the device had been sabotaged and was completely non-functional. His vehicle, which he had left at the trailhead parking area, was no longer where he had parked it when he hiked back to check on it during his second week. The car had either been moved or stolen, leaving Nathan stranded at the lodge with no means of communication or transportation. When Willem failed to appear for his scheduled weekly check-in, Nathan realized he was completely trapped at the remote location with no way to signal for help or leave the property independently. His initial assumption that equipment failures and his missing vehicle were coincidental problems began shifting toward the terrifying realization that his isolation was intentional rather than accidental. Nathan's exploration of the property's outbuildings revealed the horrifying truth about the Black Pine Mountain Lodge's real purpose. The root cellar that Willem had mentioned contained not just preserved food, but human remains in various stages of decomposition, along with personal belongings from numerous victims who had apparently been killed at the lodge over a period of several years. The generator shed had been converted into a makeshift prison cell with restraints and evidence of long-term human captivity, while the equipment storage building contained tools and supplies clearly intended for disposing of human bodies and eliminating evidence of crimes. Nathan found detailed journals documenting Willem's systematic murder of wilderness enthusiasts who came to the lodge seeking isolation, along with his methods for selecting victims who were unlikely to be missed quickly due to their solo travel patterns and disconnection from regular communication schedules. Willem's operation had been specifically designed to target adventurous individuals who sought extreme isolation and were likely to travel alone without detailed itineraries or regular check-ins with family and friends. The lodge's remote location and emphasis on self-sufficiency created perfect conditions for making people disappear without triggering immediate search efforts, since guests were expected to be out of contact for extended periods. Willem had been using the lodge's guest registration system to identify ideal victims based on their travel patterns, social connections, and likelihood of being missed if they failed to return from their wilderness expeditions. His psychological manipulation techniques involved convincing guests that they had found spiritual fulfillment in the wilderness and should abandon their previous lives, making their eventual disappearances seem like voluntary choices rather than crimes. The journals revealed that Willem had been operating his murder scheme for over a decade, targeting dozens of solo travelers, photographers, hikers, and other wilderness enthusiasts who had sought authentic isolation experiences. His method involved gradually escalating the psychological pressure on guests to extend their stays while simultaneously sabotaging their transportation and communication options, making them increasingly dependent on his assistance for survival. Willem used the harsh mountain environment as both a weapon and a cover story, creating situations where guests' deaths could be attributed to natural causes, accidents, or their own poor judgment in underestimating the dangers of wilderness survival. Those who resisted his manipulation or attempted to leave against his wishes were murdered and their bodies disposed of in remote locations throughout the vast wilderness surrounding the lodge. Nathan managed to survive by discovering Willem's approach during a planned attack and using his wilderness photography equipment and survival skills to defend himself and escape through the dangerous mountain terrain during a severe weather event that Willem had assumed would prevent any escape attempts. His eventual rescue after several days of hiking through treacherous conditions led to a massive investigation that uncovered the full scope of Willem's crimes and revealed that the Black Pine Mountain Lodge had been operating as a systematic murder site targeting the adventure travel community for over a decade. The investigation found evidence of more than 30 victims whose disappearances had been attributed to wilderness accidents, voluntary disappearances, or other explanations that had prevented proper criminal investigations. Willem's case exposed the vulnerability of solo travelers in remote locations and highlighted how predators could exploit the adventure tourism industry to access victims who actively sought isolation and were unlikely to be missed immediately when they failed to return from their expeditions.